Well, I'm joined now by Lindsay Gorman, Managing Director of the Technology Programme at the German Marshall Fund, and Professor Johnny Penn, Associate Teaching Professor of AI Ethics at the University of Cambridge. Thank you both very much for being with us. Lindsay Gorman, should we be alarmed or encouraged by the success of DeepSeek?
I think a little bit of both. It's definitely true that the United States and many of our democratic allies and partners have, over the last couple of decades, rested on our laurels a bit when it comes to technology advantage. But this is what a technology competition looks like. On the one hand, the DeepSeek advance is encouraging because they were able to come up with innovations to perform at a comparable level with comparatively less compute. And that's encouraging for what it means when we take our compute advantages and onboard some of those innovations. But I think it does raise concerns over who's going to win this AI race, where China is in it. I don't think it's too big a surprise that China is a fierce competitor here on AI, and also raises questions over open source models versus the closed models that are being developed in some of US AI labs. So definitely this wake-up call, I think the president called it right there. And David Sachs, as you mentioned, said we can't be complacent. And I think that's right.
Johnny Penn, what do you think this tells us, this huge success of DeepSeek?
I think it tells us that there's a future in cooperation. I think the idea that the US and China, that we are all globally stuck in that competition, this signals a shift towards open source, towards the power of collaboration ultimately. But there's so much money in the balance here. I think that the competition will be interpreted as such, and then the fight will continue. But I'm optimistic, hopefully, that there will be ways to kind of make the most out of AI in the long term. That's my hope.
And Johnny Penn, in terms of trying to explain to people what DeepSeek does compared with ChatGPT, is it very similar? And how do you think the Chinese have been able to do it using less energy consumption and cheaper?
Well, it's difficult to say. We're still trying to gather exactly what was used to develop it. But the sense is it's kind of like if you saw someone, build a Ferrari in their garage out of, parts that Ferrari hadn't made, you'd be quite impressed. The Chinese have managed to do this with export controls on which sort of chips they have access to, and for far less money. And what I was trying to signal to before in terms of cooperation is to speak to your point about climate. Geopolitical constraints about trade are nothing compared to climate change in the long run. And if AI is going to be a durable, kind of valuable technology, we better start working with constraints. So maybe that's the milestone we're at, that the fact that this kind of relatively new, Chinese shop is rivaling the big guys is an indication that human ingenuity may kind of be what we need most in the future, and not just investment.
Yeah, I mean, Lindsay, we've seen huge investment announced from the US only in the last few days. How much of a ripple effect, how much of a shock has it sent, do you think, into the tech sector? We've seen, obviously, a market impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no denying the market impacts. There is a bit of a shock to the system that I think the markets are wading through now and figuring out how they're going to price out, because these AI companies have really sold this idea that we need more compute and we need to scale at a hyperactive rate in order to drive advances. And it's true that DeepSeek is putting a question mark in that thesis. And so I think that's what the markets are reacting to. I would add a couple of points on this question of the differences between ChatGPT and DeepSeek, which I'm calling ChatGPT with Chinese characteristics. I think one of the key differences is that if you do ask the DeepSeek AI chatbot things about Tiananmen Square or who's the president of Taiwan or other topics that the Chinese Communist Party clearly censors and by AI regulation excludes from AI chatbots, it will say, let's talk about something else. It won't answer. And so I think that this advance not only raises the stakes for AI competition, but also clarifies them in terms of which value systems are going to be writing the rules of the road when it comes to these advances.
And Johnny Penn, the other concern, of course, on a wider scale, and certainly if China's becoming, more and more dominant in this, is who decides what the controls are on the development of AI? How autonomous could it eventually become? How creative could it become? How much of that sort of human-type intelligence that we ascribe to it does it eventually get? And if you've got a democracy like the US, which is dominant, perhaps you've got the chance of more control. China, a more opaque system, that's where a lot of people's worries are.
Yes, I mean, I think I've heard a lot of critique about China's, approaches to this. I think it's always an opportunity for us to look inwards. We are not free of censorship in this country, in the States. These technologies are extremely powerful. They add scale to censorship that is unprecedented. And I think we need government to step in to ensure that, there's democratic oversight. To the point about the environment too, that you mentioned earlier, already data centers in the States cost about $20 billion per year in terms of their public health burden. AI data centers are far worse for the environment than existing data centers. There's $300 billion spent this year on creating, the big tech companies are investing that much money to create new data centers. Basically, I think for as exciting a moment as this is, it's also a moment for reflection to say, what is the kind of populist outcome here? What does the rest of the world get? We know what the big tech companies get. We know the kind of government rivalries that exist here. What does the everyman get out of all of this? And I hope this kind of open source movement that's, gaining power will be a step in that direction, but there's a lot to figure out.
Johnny Penn and Lindsay Gorman, thank you both very much indeed for